In the year 1912, the corridors of Buckingham Palace felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage for Princess Patricia. While the world outside pulsed with the tremors of change and the suffragette movement, Patricia remained bound by the rigid protocols of the ancient British monarchy. Every step she took was monitored, and every word she spoke was weighed against the reputation of the crown. The air inside the palace was thick with the scent of old wood and beeswax, a stifling reminder of the centuries of tradition she was expected to uphold without question. Her father, representing the unwavering pillar of royal duty, held court in the dimly lit study. During their formal audiences, the silence between them was as heavy as the stone walls of the palace. He spoke of alliances, of the strategic importance of her upcoming marriage, and of the necessity of maintaining the royal image at all costs. Patricia listened, her heart sinking with every directive. There was no room for her personal desires or her thirst for independence in his cold, calculated plans for her future. The mystery of her own life seemed written in a language she wasn't allowed to speak. Seeking solace, Patricia often retreated to the vast, shadowed archives of the royal library. Beneath the towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, she discovered maps of distant lands and journals of explorers who had dared to venture beyond the known horizons. The texture of the ancient parchment beneath her fingertips felt more real than the silk of her gowns. In these forbidden texts, she found a different kind of history, one of courage and self-discovery. She began to trace the roots of those who had vanished from society, her mind weaving a plan that grew bolder with every page she turned. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Patricia stumbled upon a hidden compartment within a centuries-old desk. Inside lay a collection of letters from a forgotten relative who had similarly chafed under the weight of the crown. The letters spoke of a secret passage, a route used by the staff to bypass the main gates during times of unrest. This discovery was the catalyst Patricia needed. The mystery of her lineage provided the map for her escape. The shadows of the past were no longer a threat. They were now her most valuable allies in her quest for freedom. Standing on the high stone balcony overlooking the city, Patricia watched the common folk of London moving through the evening mist. They lived lives of hardship, certainly, but they also possessed a liberty she could only dream of. The flickering street lamps illuminated a world that was messy, vibrant, and uncontrolled. To her, the chaos of the city was far more appealing than the sterile perfection of the court. She watched a young woman laughing in the distance, a simple sound that echoed with a profound sense of autonomy that Patricia felt she had been denied since birth. Through a trusted contact within the palace staff, Patricia managed to send a message to a former tutor who had long since left the royal service. The reply came weeks later, hidden within a bundle of laundry. It contained instructions and a promise of sanctuary in the coastal town of St. Ives. The risk was immense. Any slip-up would result in a scandal that would ruin her and lead to even stricter confinement. Yet, the prospect of a life lived on her own terms outweighed the fear of discovery. The plan was set, and the wheels of her departure began to turn. On the night of her planned departure, Patricia moved with careful precision. She sat at her ornate vanity, looking at the reflection of a woman she no longer recognized. One by one, she removed the heavy jewels that defined her status, the emeralds, the pearls, and the diamonds that had belonged to queens before her. She left them piled on the velvet cloth, a silent renunciation of her royal heritage. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to count down the final moments of her life as a princess. The palace at night was a labyrinth of shifting shadows and echoes. Patricia waited for the precise moment when the guard rotation changed, a routine she had memorized over weeks of observation. The rhythmic clatter of boots on stone signaled their movement away from the servants' wing. She pressed herself against the cold walls, her breath shallow and quiet. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. The documentary-like gravity of her situation pressed down on her, but she did not falter, moving deeper into the dark heart of the palace. In the dimly lit servants' quarters, Patricia changed into a set of plain woolen clothes she had managed to secure. She traded her silk slippers for sturdy leather boots and wrapped a heavy, dark cloak around her shoulders. She pulled the hood low, concealing her face and the distinctive golden hair that marked her royal blood. In the mirror, she saw a shadow of her former self, a commoner ready to disappear into the night. The transformation was complete. She was no longer a royal asset. She was a woman reclaiming her own identity from the clutches of history. The final hurdle was the iron gate at the edge of the gardens, rarely used and often overlooked by the main security detail. Patricia turned the rusted key she had procured, the sound of the lock clicking open feeling like a liberation. She stepped through the gate and into the damp, foggy air of the London night. Behind her, the palace loomed like a stone monolith, a relic of a life she was leaving behind forever. As she vanished into the deep shadows of the city, the princess was gone, and her journey toward a new, uncertain future had finally begun. The damp chill of the London docks clawed at Patricia's skin as she moved through the swirling mist. Her heavy woolen cloak, once a costume for a palace play, now served as her only shield against the prying eyes of the night watchman. Every footfall on the slick cobblestones felt like a drumbeat, echoing her heart's frantic rhythm. She was no longer a princess wrapped in silk. She was a shadow among shadows, a ghost drifting through the labyrinthine alleys of the East End. The scent of salt and rotting timber replaced the lavender-scented halls she had known all her life, grounding her in a harsh, new reality. At the stroke of midnight, Patricia reached a weathered wooden door marked with a faint chalk cross. This was the safe house promised by the underground network of dissidents she had secretly contacted. The door creaked open to reveal a cramped, candle-lit room filled with the smell of old paper and tobacco. A man with a scarred face, a former palace guard who had lost his position for speaking the truth, stood waiting. He did not bow. He did not offer a royal title. To him, she was merely another soul seeking a way out of the crown's suffocating grip. And that was exactly what she wanted. Back at the palace, the sun began to peek over the stone battlements, casting long, sharp shadows across the courtyard. A young maid entered the royal chambers, her arms full of fresh linens, only to find the bed undisturbed and the window ajar. The silence in the room was deafening. Within minutes, the alarm was raised, but it was a quiet, panicked mobilization. The king could not afford a public scandal. The disappearance of his daughter had to be handled with the utmost discretion. Behind closed doors, the machinery of the royal intelligence began to turn, scouring the city for a princess who had effectively ceased to exist. In the safety of the dim room, Patricia took a pair of rusted shears to her long chestnut hair. Each lock that fell to the floor felt like a weight being lifted from her soul. This was the final transformation, a shedding of the identity that had defined her every movement for 20 years. As she looked into a cracked mirror, she saw a stranger staring back, a woman with sharp eyes and a determined jaw, no longer a decorative piece of the court. She traded her fine linen chemise for a rough, homespun tunic, feeling the scratchy fabric against her skin as a badge of her newfound independence. The former guard, Thomas, laid out a map of the shipping routes on the scarred wooden table. He pointed to a small fishing vessel scheduled to depart for the northern coast under the cover of the morning fog. They won't look for a princess on a trawler," he whispered, his voice like gravel. Patricia studied the lines and ink, her mind memorizing the path to the sea. The plan was perilous. The Royal Navy patrolled the Thames with relentless efficiency. But the water offered a path that the guarded roads did not. She was trading the cage of stone for the uncertainty of the tide. As the palace search parties fanned out in secret, the king's most trusted investigator, a man known only as the Raven, arrived at the garden gate. He knelt in the damp soil, examining the scuff marks and the rusted lock. His eyes, cold and calculating, missed nothing. He found a single thread of silk caught on a briar, a fragment of the life she had left behind. The Raven didn't need a trail of breadcrumbs. He understood the psychology of the hunted. He knew she wouldn't stay in the affluent districts. He turned his gaze toward the river, where the fog was thickest and the law was weakest. Patricia and Thomas moved through the warehouse district, their silhouettes blurring against the stacks of crates and barrels. The sound of distant shouting and the rhythmic thumping of horses' hooves signaled that the search was intensifying. They ducked into a narrow crawl space as a patrol of the king's men passed by, their lanterns cutting through the mist like searching eyes. Patricia held her breath, her back pressed against the cold stone, feeling the vibration of the city's pulse. The proximity of her pursuers was a reminder that freedom was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a single misstep or a wayward glance. A sudden memory flashed through Patricia's mind. Her father, the king, standing on the balcony of the great hall, his hand heavy on her shoulder as he announced her betrothal to a man she loathed. The weight of that hand had felt like an iron shackle. In the darkness of the London night, that memory served as a fuel for her resolve. She would rather perish in the freezing waters of the Thames than return to that golden prison. Every step away from the palace was a step toward a life where her heart belonged to herself and no one else. The past was a dying fire, and she was moving toward the cold, honest dawn. They reached the river's edge, where the black water lapped hungrily against the rotting piers. The fishing boat, the Sea Wraith, sat low in the water, its sails furled and its crew moving with practiced, silent efficiency. Thomas handed her a small pouch of silver and a forged set of papers. "You are no longer a princess," he reminded her, his eyes meeting hers with a rare moment of respect. "You are a survivor now." Patricia nodded, tucking the papers into her tunic. She stepped onto the swaying deck, the transition from solid ground to the shifting sea marking the point of no return. As the Sea Wraith pushed off from the dock, the first light of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, a pale gray line separating the sky from the water. Patricia stood at the stern, watching the silhouette of the palace and the city of London shrink into the distance. The fog began to lift, revealing the vastness of the river leading to the open sea. She was cold, tired, and hunted, but for the first time in her life, she was breathing air that didn't belong to the crown. The journey ahead was a blank page, and the ink was finally in her own hands. The Sea Wraith cut through the choppy waters of the Thames estuary, its timber groaning under the weight of the morning wind. Patricia moved away from the rail, her legs unsteady as she found her way toward the cramped quarters below. The crew, a collection of weathered men with secrets of their own, watched her with silent curiosity. She kept her hood pulled low, the rough wool scratching against her neck, a stark contrast to the silks she had worn only hours ago. Every creak of the hull sounded like a footstep from a pursuing guard, yet the distance from London grew with every passing knot. Inside the dimly lit cabin, the air was thick with the scent of brine and old tobacco. Patricia reached into the hidden pocket of her cloak, her fingers brushing against a small, wax-sealed envelope she had snatched from her father's private study. It was a ledger fragment, a cryptic map of alliances that hinted at a dark bargain between the crown and a foreign power. If she were caught with this, her escape would be the least of her crimes. She realized now that she wasn't just running for her freedom. She was carrying the very secret that could dismantle the monarchy she left behind. As the ship reached the open sea, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the waves began to swell with predatory intent. Patricia braced herself against a bulkhead as the vessel pitched violently. This was the ocean's welcome, a reminder that the world outside the palace walls was indifferent to her title. She watched through a small porthole as the horizon vanished behind walls of gray water. The physical toll of the journey was beginning to set in, but the adrenaline of her transgression kept her upright. She was a ghost now, haunting the transition between her old life and an uncertain future. Captain Thorne entered the cabin, his presence filling the small space with an aura of seasoned danger. He was a man of few words, his face a map of scars and sun-faded skin. He looked at Patricia, not as a princess, but as a liability that paid well. "The storm will hold us back," he grunted, his voice like grinding stones. He didn't ask her name, and she didn't offer it. In this world of salt and shadow, names were weights that could sink a man. He placed a compass on the table, its needle spinning wildly, mirroring the chaos of Patricia's own heart. Back in the heart of London, the dawn brought no peace. Inside the king's private chambers, the silence was shattered by the discovery of the princess's empty bed. King Edward stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the gray morning light. The betrayal tasted like ash in his mouth. He didn't call for a public search. To do so would admit a vulnerability the crown could not afford. Instead, he summoned the Black Ravens, his personal network of shadow operatives. They were to find her, not for her safety, but to recover what she had stolen from his desk. Inspector Graves, the lead investigator of the Ravens, sifted through Patricia's discarded gowns with clinical precision. He found a single scorched petal of a white rose in the fireplace, a flower that didn't grow in the palace gardens. It was a clue, a breadcrumb left by a girl who had planned her exit with terrifying intelligence. Graves knew the princess was clever, but he also knew the sea was a cruel master. He mapped out the tides and the schedules of every vessel that had cleared the docks since midnight. The hunt was no longer a matter of duty. It was a game of chess. On the Sea Wraith, Patricia took the heavy gold signet ring from her finger, the seal of her lineage. It felt like a shackle, a piece of the gilded cage she had finally escaped. With a steady hand, she leaned over the rail and let it drop. She watched it disappear into the churn of the wake, a tiny glint of gold swallowed by the infinite gray. She was no longer a daughter of the bloodline. She was a nameless passenger on a smuggling vessel. The weight off her hand was immediate, but the weight on her soul remained, heavy with the secrets she still carried. The ship skirted the rugged coastline of Cornwall, where ancient ruins clung to the cliffs like skeletal fingers. The Sea Wraith needed to resupply in secret, avoiding the main ports where the king's influence was absolute. Patricia stood on the deck, watching the jagged rocks pass by. This landscape felt older than the monarchy itself, a land of myths and forgotten kings. It was here that she realized the scale of the world she had entered. It was vast, cold, and entirely indifferent to the divine right of kings. She felt small, but for the first time, she felt real. A messenger pigeon, exhausted and damp from the sea air, landed on the ship's mast. Captain Thorne's first mate intercepted it, untying a small cylinder from its leg. The message inside was coded, but the royal seal was unmistakable. The king's reach was longer than Patricia had imagined. The crew huddled in the shadows of the mainmast, whispering as they looked toward the girl in the wool cloak. The price on her head was likely growing by the hour. Patricia saw them looking and felt the first true spark of fear. In the world of men, loyalty was often a matter of price. Night fell over the Atlantic, a thick blanket of darkness that erased the line between sea and sky. Patricia lay on a rough straw mattress in the hold, the smell of damp wood and dried fish filling her lungs. The luxury of the palace was a fading dream, replaced by the hard reality of survival. She clutched her bag to her chest, the stolen documents crinkling softly. Sleep would not come easily. Every sound of the ship's hull felt like a whisper of her father's voice. She was free, but the cost of that freedom was a life spent looking over her shoulder into the dark. Dawn arrived not with a golden glow, but with a bruised gray light that seeped through the cracks of the wooden hull. Patricia hauled herself up the narrow ladder, her joints stiff from the dampness and the hard straw mattress. On the deck, the Atlantic was a churning expanse of leaden water, the horizon lost in a thick mist. The air was biting, a salt-laden wind that whipped her hair across her face and chilled her to the bone. She leaned against the salt-crusted railing, watching the ship's wake carve a temporary white path through the infinite dark sea. Behind her lay the life of a princess. Ahead, a vast, terrifying void. The sheer scale of the ocean made her struggle feel minuscule, yet the weight of the stolen papers in her bodice remained heavy and undeniable. A heavy footfall echoed against the damp planks behind her. Patricia turned to find a weather-beaten sailor staring at her with eyes narrowed in suspicion. He wore a tattered wool coat, and his skin was like cured leather, etched with the scars of a lifetime at sea. "You're a long way from home, lass," he grumbled, his voice like grinding stones. Patricia kept her chin high, projecting a confidence she didn't feel. She was no longer a royal, but she still possessed the sharp, authoritative tongue of the elite. She replied that she was a widow seeking work in the colonies. The sailor didn't look convinced, his gaze lingering on her hands, which were far too soft for a commoner. He spat into the sea and turned away, but the seed of doubt was planted. Retreating to a secluded, shadowy corner of the hold, Patricia finally unfolded the stolen documents by the flickering light of a stolen candle. The wax dripped onto the rough, dark wood as she read. These were not mere administrative records. They were transcripts of secret meetings between her father and the leaders of a shadowed cabal. They spoke of a lineage that wasn't hers, of ancient bloodlines used as mere pawns for geopolitical gain. The ink on the yellowed paper seemed to pulse with a dark energy. She realized then that her escape wasn't just about freedom from an unwanted marriage. It was an escape from a centuries-old conspiracy that threatened to consume the very foundations of the British crown and her own identity. By the third day, the Atlantic turned violent. The ship groaned under the assault of mountainous waves that crashed over the prow with the force of a hammer. Patricia clung to her bunk as the world tilted at impossible angles, the wood screaming under the pressure. The darkness of the hold was absolute, save for the occasional flash of lightning through the deck slats. Screams of men and the frantic neighing of horses in the lower decks created a cacophony of terror. In the chaos, she felt strangely calm. If the sea took her now, the secrets she carried would die with her, safe from her father's reach. But she gripped her bag tighter. She was not ready for the ocean to be her final resting place. The storm eventually broke, leaving behind a cold, clinging mist that obscured the world. On the horizon, a jagged coastline finally emerged, a rugged silhouette of dark pines and gray stone. It was a wild, untamed land, far removed from the manicured gardens and marble halls of her childhood. The ship navigated the narrow inlet toward a settlement of wooden shacks and flickering oil lamps. This was St. John's, a threshold to a new world and a second chance. Patricia stood among the weary, salt-stained passengers, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air here smelled of pine needles and wood smoke, a stark contrast to the stagnant air of the palace. She took a deep breath of the freezing air, tasting the first true draft of independence. Her boots touched the solid earth of the wharf with a jarring finality. The ground felt as though it were still swaying, a lingering ghost of the Atlantic's rhythm. Patricia moved through the throng of laborers and merchants, her hood pulled low to hide her features. The port was a hive of desperate activity. Men with hollow eyes hauled crates of salted fish, and women in tattered shawls bartered for scraps of survival. She was a ghost among them, a princess of a kingdom that felt worlds away. Every glance from a passerby felt like an interrogation. She needed to disappear into the fog before the harbor master began his official tally of the new arrivals and recognized her refined gait. She found a modest inn tucked away in a narrow, muddy alley, its sign creaking ominously in the wind. The Drowned Anchor was a place for those who didn't want to be found, a sanctuary for the lost and the guilty. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cheap ale, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies. A low fire sputtered in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the soot-stained walls and the weary faces of the patrons. Patricia approached the heavy wooden counter, her hand resting on the hidden pouch of coins. She needed a room, a place to think, and a place to hide the evidence of her former life. The silence of the room was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. The innkeeper, a woman with a face like a crumpled, ancient map, stared at Patricia with clinical indifference. "Name?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp that sounded like parchment rubbing together. "Mary Miller," Patricia replied, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She slid a silver coin across the scarred table, more than the room was worth. The woman's eyes sparked with a brief, cold flash of greed before she pocketed the coin and handed over a heavy iron key. There were no questions about her origin or her destination. In this town, everyone had a secret they were running from. Patricia climbed the stairs, the wood groaning under her weight, feeling the eyes of the other patrons burning into her back like hot coals. In the solitude of her cramped, freezing room, Patricia sat at a small, rickety desk. She pulled out a quill and a scrap of paper, her hand trembling with exhaustion. She began to write a letter to her sister, Princess Margaret, a confession of why she left, and a warning of the dark conspiracy she had found in their father's study. But as the ink dried in the dim light, she realized the terrible danger such a letter posed. If it were intercepted, it would be a death warrant for them both. She watched the words for a moment, then held the paper to the candle flame. The truth turned to black ash in her hand, a secret too heavy to share even with those she loved. A sudden commotion in the muddy street below drew her to the window. Peering through the grime-streaked glass, she saw a group of men in dark, tailored overcoats. Men who looked entirely out of place in this rough, salt-stained port. They were showing a sketch to a local constable, their movements precise and disciplined. Her heart froze in her chest. Her father's reach was longer and faster than she had ever imagined. They hadn't just followed her, they had anticipated her arrival. The port was no longer a refuge. It was a closing trap. Patricia backed away from the window, her mind racing. The escape was over. The game of shadows had truly begun, and she was the prey. Patricia fled the room, her hands trembling as she secured the clasp of her worn traveling cloak. The creak of the floorboards sounded like thunder in the silent inn. She couldn't take the front stairs. The agents were likely already converging on the main entrance. Slipping through a narrow side door used by the kitchen staff, she entered a labyrinth of damp stone and charcoal smoke. The smell of stale ale and salt air hit her as she plunged into the shadows, leaving behind the only warmth she had known for days, her breath hitching in the frigid night air. Outside, the fog had rolled in from the Atlantic, thick and cloying, turning the harbor into a ghost world. Patricia pressed her back against the rough-hewn timber of a warehouse, her breath visible in the freezing air. Every footfall on the cobblestones sounded like a death knell. She watched as the silhouettes of the men in overcoats passed by the mouth of the alley, their lanterns cutting sharp, golden blades through the gray mist. They moved with the predatory grace of trained hounds, their eyes scanning every doorway for the missing royal, their presence a dark stain on the night. A sudden hand reached out from the gloom, pulling her into a recessed doorway. Patricia almost screamed, but a rough hand covered her mouth. It was an old woman, her face a map of deep lines and salt spray weathered skin, dressed in tattered wool. The woman didn't speak. She simply pointed toward a row of fish-gutting tables further down the pier. There, the stench was unbearable, but the activity was frantic enough to provide cover. Patricia nodded. A silent pact formed in the darkness between a fallen royal and a common laborer who recognized a soul in flight. Back at the inn, the lead agent, a man with a cold, aristocratic face and a scar across his brow, kicked open the door to Patricia's room. The room was empty, the bed barely rumpled. He ran a gloved hand over the glass of the window, still warm from her touch. He turned to his men, his voice a low, melodic growl that carried the weight of the king's authority. He knew she was close. He ordered a full blockade of the harbor, his shadow stretching long and menacing against the parchment-colored walls of the tiny, abandoned room. Patricia moved through the gutting sheds, her fine boots ruined by the filth of the floor. She kept her head low, pulling her hood further over her face. Around her, the rhythmic thud of knives and the coarse shouting of the workers created a wall of noise. She found a stack of empty crates near the edge of the wharf, marked for a merchant vessel bound for the Mediterranean. She realized this was her only chance, to hide among the cargo before the final inspection began, and the harbor was sealed tight by her father's relentless pursuers. As she crouched in the cramped darkness between the crates, memories of the palace gardens flashed before her eyes. The stifling weight of the crown, the endless ceremonies, and the cold indifference of her father's gaze felt worlds away. Here, amidst the smell of brine and rot, she felt a strange sense of agency she never possessed in the gilded halls of London. The mystery of her family's legacy, the secrets hidden in the royal archives, felt more real now than ever. She wasn't just running from a marriage, she was running from a destiny written in betrayal. Through a gap in the crates, Patricia watched the agents interrogate a ship's captain. The captain, a stout man with a beard like iron wool, looked unimpressed by their credentials. However, the lead agent whispered something, leaning in close, and the captain's face paled instantly. He nodded frantically and gestured toward the very row of crates where Patricia was hiding. The royal reach wasn't just about gold. It's about the secrets they held over every man in the kingdom. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of wood and iron. The heavy thud of a crane beginning to lift the cargo broke the tension. Patricia realized her crate was being moved. She braced herself as the wood groaned, the world tilting as she was hoisted into the air. Through the slats, she saw the harbor below, a sea of gray water and dark figures. The agents were swarming the pier, checking every face. She was suspended between the life she fled and an uncertain future, swinging precariously over the dark abyss of the harbor while the rain began to fall in cold, thin needles. The crate landed with a bone-jarring thud on the deck of the Iron Maiden. Patricia stayed silent, her muscles aching from the impact. Above her, the crew shouted orders and the heavy chains clattered. She could hear the Liad agent's voice on the deck, demanding a final sweep of the hold. He was inches away, his polished boots clicking on the wet wood just above her head. The scent of his expensive tobacco drifted through the cracks, a reminder of the world she was desperately trying to leave behind. Lurking just beyond the wood, the ship groaned as it began to pull away from the quay. The sound of the waves churning against the hull was the most beautiful music Patricia had ever heard. In the darkness of the hold, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket, the only piece of her former life she kept. It contained a coded map her mother had hidden years ago. As the lights of the port faded into the distance through a porthole, she knew the journey had only just begun. She was no longer a princess. She was a ghost on the water. Inside the damp, echoing belly of the merchant vessel, Patricia sought a corner far from the prying eyes of the crew. The air was thick with the scent of brine and old timber. She carefully pried open the silver locket, the metal cool against her trembling palm. Beneath a miniature portrait of her mother lay the folded scrap of vellum, its ink faded but still legible. It was more than a map. It was a testament to a secret heritage her family had spent generations trying to erase. Every line and notch on the parchment whispered of a sanctuary hidden in the northern wilds, far from the suffocating grasp of the palace. Her solitude was short-lived, as the heavy thud of boots sounded on the wooden stairs. A burly deckhand, his face obscured by the low-hanging beams, descended into the hold to check the cargo. Patricia pulled her hood low, pressing herself into the gap between two heavy wool crates. The man's lantern cast long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls like specters of her past. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, fearing that any small sound would betray her presence. The sailor paused, sniffing the air, but eventually moved on, leaving her once again in the oppressive silence of her floating prison. As the ship crested a particularly high wave, Patricia's mind drifted back to her mother's final days. The queen had spoken in riddles, her voice a mere rasp. She had warned Patricia that the crown was not a gift, but a tether to a dying world. The coded map was her only inheritance, a guide to a place called the Silent Cloister. It was an ancient refuge for those who knew too much and wished to be forgotten. In the flickering light, the princess realized her mother hadn't just died. She had been slowly consumed by the very secrets Patricia was now carrying across the sea. By the third night, a violent storm gripped the vessel, throwing Patricia against the rough-hewn hull. The ship groaned in agony, the timber screeching as if it were about to splinter. Water began to seep through the seams, pooling around her boots. In the chaos of the swaying lanterns and crashing crates, she felt a strange sense of liberation. The storm was a physical manifestation of the turmoil she had left behind. Every jolt of the ship felt like a break from her old life, a violent shedding of the skin of a princess. She clung to the locket, her only anchor in the darkness. When the storm finally broke, A pale, sickly dawn filtered through the grime-covered porthole. Patricia sat exhausted, her fingers tracing the map's hidden lines. She noticed a series of faint pinpricks that only became visible when held against the morning light. They formed a constellation that pointed toward the rugged coast of the Scottish Highlands. The realization hit her with the force of a blow. Her destination was not a city, but a ruin. Her mother had sent her to the very edge of the world, to a place where the royal reach had long since withered into myth and legend. The ship finally reached a desolate northern port, a cluster of stone buildings clinging to the jagged cliffs. The air was biting and smelled of peat smoke and cold iron. Patricia waited until the crew was occupied with the gangplank before slipping over the side, landing softly on the wet stone of the wharf. She moved like a shadow through the thick fog, her royal gait replaced by a cautious, hunched stride. The people here were rugged and weathered, their eyes hard and suspicious. To them, she was just another traveler lost in the mist, a ghost without a crown. Walking through the narrow, winding alleys of the port town, Patricia felt the weight of her choice. Every corner turned was a step further from the comforts of the palace. She found herself standing before a weathered sign depicting a white hart, its paint peeling from years of salt air. This was the first landmark on her mother's map. The tavern was a low-slung building of heavy timber and blackened stone, a place where secrets were bought with silver and kept with steel. She adjusted her cloak, hid the silver locket beneath her shirt, and stepped into the dim, smoke-filled interior. Inside the tavern, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of cheap ale and unwashed bodies. Patricia navigated the crowded room, her eyes searching for a man mentioned in the map's margins, a contact known only as the Falconer. She found him in the darkest corner, a man whose face was a map of scars and stories. He didn't look up as she approached, his attention focused on a small, sharp knife he was using to clean his fingernails. She sat across from him, placing a single gold coin, marked with the royal seal she was trying to flee, on the table between them. The falconer glanced at the coin and then at Patricia, his eyes narrowing. He didn't seem impressed by the royal gold. Instead, he looked at her with a mixture of pity and wariness. He leaned forward, his voice a low growl that barely carried over the tavern's din. He told her that the king's men had already arrived in the north, distributing sketches of a traitorous princess to every outpost. Patricia realized then that her escape hadn't gone unnoticed. The crown wasn't just looking for a lost daughter. They were hunting a threat to the stability of the entire British throne. Realizing the danger, Patricia knew she had to destroy the last remnants of her identity. She followed the falconer to a small hearth at the back of the tavern. With a steady hand, she pulled a small silk ribbon from her hair, the one that had marked her as a lady of the court, and tossed it into the flames. As the silk curled and turned to ash, she felt the final chords of her old life snap. She was no longer Princess Patricia. She was a fugitive, a seeker of truths, and a woman who would rather walk through fire than return to a gilded cage. Patricia stepped out from the tavern's smoky warmth into the biting night air. The falconer did not look back, his silhouette already merging with the dense thicket at the edge of the sleeping village. She adjusted her rough woolen cloak, the weight of it a stark contrast to the light silks she once wore. Every snap of a twig felt like a soldier's footstep. The village behind her was a collection of guttering lanterns, fading into a memory of a life she could never reclaim. Ahead lay the unknown, a wilderness of shadows where a princess was nothing. They moved through the mist-shrouded moors of northern Britain, where the land itself seemed to guard ancient secrets. The falconer moved with an unnatural silence, guided by instincts honed far from the rigid protocols of the court. Patricia struggled to match his pace, her boots sinking into the damp earth. The dampness seeped into her bones, but the cold was a reminder that she was alive and free. Above, the moon was a pale, judgmental eye peering through the heavy cloud cover, watching as the daughter of a king became a ghost of the heather. A sudden metallic clatter echoed through the valley, causing the falconer to pull Patricia behind a massive, moss-covered standing stone. In the distance, a line of torches snaked along the lower ridge, the king's outriders. Patricia held her breath, pressing her back against the cold, ancient rock. The smell of wet earth and ancient rain filled her lungs. She realized then that her father would never stop searching, not out of love, but out of the need to control his most valuable political asset. The torches flickered like malevolent stars before disappearing into the tree line. By dawn, they reached a narrow stone bridge spanning a churning river. The structure was crumbling, a relic of a Roman past long forgotten by the locals. The falconer paused, scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. Patricia looked down at the icy water, seeing her own reflection, haggard, soot-streaked, and unrecognizable. This was the boundary. Crossing this river meant leaving the administrative reaches of the crown. She stepped onto the bridge, the ancient stones groaning under her weight, symbolizing the finality of her departure. There was no path back to the palace from here. They found refuge in the ruins of a forgotten chapel, its roof long since claimed by the sky. Ivy choked the stone altars, and the air tasted of damp stone and history. The falconer finally spoke, his voice a low rasp that seemed to belong to the shadows. He explained that the king's secrets were buried deeper than Patricia ever imagined, hidden in ledgers that tracked not gold, but lives. As he spoke, he produced a weathered scroll, its wax seal broken. Patricia realized her escape was merely the first step into a much larger conspiracy. Patricia pored over the scroll by the light of a single tallow candle. The ink was faded, but the names were clear. Her mother's kin, marked for exile or worse. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her life at court had been a lie built upon the systematic erasure of her own maternal lineage. The falconer watched her, his face a mask of grim empathy. He had been a guardian of these truths for years, waiting for a royal who was brave enough to see the world for what it truly was, a cage of glass. To survive the next leg of their journey, Patricia knew her appearance had to change further. She took a rusted blade from her belt and with a trembling hand sheared off her long, chestnut hair. The tresses fell to the dirt floor like discarded silk. She then rubbed charcoal into her face and hands, masking the porcelain skin that spoke of privilege. When she looked up, even the falconer seemed surprised. The princess was dead. In her place stood a common traveler, hardened by the road and fueled by a burning desire to dismantle the throne that had deceived her. The falconer warned her that the king had hired mercenaries, men who didn't care for royal blood. Only the weight of the gold promised for her return. They sat in silence, listening to the wind howl through the glassless windows of the chapel. He told her of a hidden village in the highlands where the old laws still held sway, a place where she might find allies, but the road there was long and patrolled by those who served the crown's shadow. Patricia nodded, her resolve hardening. She was no longer running away. She was running toward a confrontation. Days later, they passed a village square from a distance. Nailed to a weathered oak was a parchment bearing a likeness of the princess. The reward was enough to buy a dozen farms. Patricia watched from the tree line as a group of villagers gathered around it, their faces a mix of greed and fear. She saw how the crown used her disappearance to tighten its grip on the local population, claiming she had been abducted by enemies of the state. The lie was a masterclass in manipulation, making her realize that her father's reach was as much about narrative as it was about steel. As the sun began to set behind the jagged peaks of the north, Patricia turned her back on the lowlands forever. The air grew thinner and colder, carrying the scent of pine and ancient ice. She and the falconer began the ascent into the mountains, leaving the familiar roads for the goat paths of the high ridges. The journey ahead promised no comfort, only the harsh reality of survival. Yet for the first time in her life, Patricia felt a sense of peace. The cage was far behind her, and the truth, however cold, was finally within her grasp. The air grew thin as Patricia and the falconer reached a desolate plateau, a shelf of granite suspended between the clouds and the abyss. The wind here was a constant, mournful whistle, biting through the heavy furs they had donned. Behind them, the kingdom was nothing more than a smudge of gray on the horizon, a distant memory of stone and protocol. Patricia's boots were worn, her hands calloused, yet she moved with a rhythmic purpose she had never known in the gilded halls. They were no longer running, they were ascending, seeking a sanctuary that existed only in the falconer's cryptic maps. That evening, huddled beneath a natural rock overhang, the falconer kindled a small, controlled fire. In the flickering light, he spoke for the first time of the order that once guarded these heights, men and women who had turned their backs on the crown to preserve the ancient truths of the land. Patricia watched the embers, seeing in their dance the embers of her own old life fading away. The heat was meager against the mountain's chill, but the warmth of a shared secret provided a different kind of comfort. She was learning that freedom was not the absence of struggle, but the choice of which struggle to endure. As dawn broke, they encountered the skeletal remains of an ancient watchtower, a crumbling finger of stone pointing toward the heavens. It was a relic from an era before the first king had unified the lowlands, a testament to a forgotten architecture. Patricia touched the cold masonry, feeling the pulse of history beneath her fingertips. This was a place the royal archives had never mentioned, a blind spot in the history of her family. The falconer stood guard at the threshold, his eyes scanning the mist-covered slopes below for any sign of the royal scouts who might still be on their trail. Inside the tower's base, the falconer revealed a hidden cache behind a loose flagstone. Within lay a collection of silver-bound journals and rusted instruments of navigation. Patricia realized then that their journey wasn't just an escape, it was a recovery mission. These were the records of the exiles, the scholars who had fled the court generations ago when the monarchy began to suppress the old ways. As she leafed through the brittle pages, she saw her own family name mentioned in a context of betrayal. The mystery of her lineage was deeper and darker than any court gossip had ever suggested. The weather turned with a sudden, violent ferocity. A mountain gale swept in, carrying shards of ice that stung like needles. They were forced to cling to the leeward side of the cliffs, their progress slowed to a crawl. The falconer led the way, his knowledge of the terrain the only thing standing between them and a fall into the white void. Patricia felt the weight of her choice in every frozen breath. There was no room for royal pride here. The mountain did not care for titles. Her survival depended entirely on her resolve and her trust in a man she had once considered a common servant. Seeking refuge from the blizzard, they found a narrow cave system that wound deep into the mountain's heart. The silence inside was deafening after the roar of the wind. They moved through the darkness by the light of a single tallow candle, the flame dancing nervously in the damp air. The walls were slick with moisture, reflecting the light in strange, distorted patterns. Here, in the belly of the earth, the falconer confessed that his own father had been a casualty of the king's purge. This journey was his vengeance, a way to ensure the truths the crown feared would finally be brought to light. As they rested, Patricia questioned the falconer about the nature of the king's pursuit. He explained that the crown didn't just want her back for the sake of marriage. They feared what she represented, a bloodline that held the key to an ancient claim older than the current dynasty. If she remained free, the very foundation of her father's rule was at risk. The weight of this realization settled heavily upon her. She was not just a runaway princess. She was a living threat to the status quo. Every mile they traveled further into the mountains was a strike against the throne she had once called home. Morning brought a fragile peace as the storm broke, revealing a vista of the hidden valley beyond the peaks. It was a lush, green world tucked away from the eyes of the lowlands, guarded by the impassable ridges they had just traversed. The sun hit the valley floor, illuminating the ruins of an ancient settlement that looked more like a sanctuary than a fortress. Patricia felt a surge of hope. This was the place the falconer had promised, a world where the rules of the court held no power. It was beautiful, wild, and utterly isolated, the perfect cradle for a new beginning. Descending toward the valley, they found signs of a recent presence. A stack of cut wood, a trail of smoke from a distant hearth. This was not a ghost town. It was inhabited. The falconer moved with caution, his hand near his belt, signaling for Patricia to stay close. They were no longer alone in the wilderness. The mystery of who lived here, and whether they would welcome a fugitive princess, hung in the air like the morning mist. Patricia braced herself, knowing that while she had escaped her father's world, she was now entering another with its own unknown laws and ancient allegiances. At the edge of the settlement, they were met not by soldiers, but by a group of elders clad in simple, woven robes. Their faces were etched with the same lines of the mountain, their eyes wise and unblinking. They did not bow, for here there were no sovereigns. Instead, the eldest among them stepped forward and placed a hand on Patricia's shoulder, recognizing the lineage in her eyes. "You have come a long way, daughter of the high peaks," he whispered. Patricia realized she had not just found a hiding place. She had found the people her family had tried to erase from the world's memory. The elder led Patricia into a cavernous hall carved into the living rock, where the air was thick with the scent of pine and ancient stone. Torches flickered against walls covered in intricate, weathered carvings that told a story far different from the palace scrolls. Here, the history of the realm was preserved not in gold or vanity, but in the enduring grain of the earth. Patricia saw figures that resembled her own ancestors, yet they were depicted as part of a harmonious collective, not as solitary conquerors. She realized her royal lineage was far older and more complex than the archives ever admitted. The elders unrolled a scroll of heavy, dark parchment, revealing a map older than any in the royal library. It showed the mountains not as a barren border, but as the vibrant heart of a lost kingdom. The elder pointed to a symbol, a sun rising behind three jagged peaks, the original crest of her house, before it was twisted into a crown. "Your fathers turned the light into a cage of gold," he whispered. Patricia touched the ink, feeling the weight of centuries of betrayal. Her family hadn't just conquered the land, they had stolen its identity and erased its people. As she studied the records, the truth of the Great Erasure became chillingly clear. Centuries ago, the royal line had purged the mountain clans to consolidate power, branding the survivors as myths to be forgotten. Patricia's father had often spoken of securing the borders, a phrase that now echoed in her mind with a horrific new meaning. She felt a profound sense of shame. Every silk dress she had ever worn and every banquet she had attended was paid for with the silence of these stone halls. The mystery of her heritage was a puzzle built of stolen history. That evening, the settlement gathered in a natural amphitheater beneath the stars, where a massive mural depicted a great eagle shackled by golden chains. There was no music, only the low, rhythmic hum of a chant that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. The elders explained that the eagle represented the spirit of the peaks, the same spirit Patricia felt stirring within her soul. She was no longer just a runaway princess. She was a witness to a living ghost of a civilization. She was a survivor of her own family's ruthlessness, standing among those they tried to destroy. "The blood of the peaks runs through you, Patricia," the eldest woman said, her voice like grinding stones. She handed Patricia a necklace of raw, unpolished obsidian that felt heavy and cold against her skin. The elders spoke of an ancient prophecy, a daughter who would return when the throne had become a cage. Patricia realized her escape was not merely a flight from a forced marriage, but a journey toward an older, more terrifying duty. She was the bridge between two broken worlds, tasked with reclaiming a truth that had been buried for generations. Days turned into weeks as Patricia integrated into the hidden life of the settlement. She learned the language of signs carved into bark and the way to read the wind's whisper before a mountain storm. The elders taught her the song of the earth, a series of low-frequency hums used to navigate the lightless tunnels deep beneath the peaks. Her royal posture softened into a scout's crouch. She shed the last vestiges of the palace's artificiality, her hands becoming calloused and her mind sharpening. The mystery of the mountains was becoming her reality, displacing the lies of her childhood. Despite her growing sense of belonging, a shadow of fear remained. Patricia often stood at the edge of the cliffs, looking back toward the distant, hazy plains where the capital lay hidden in the mist. She knew the king's hunters would never stop searching for her. Her father viewed her as state property, a key to a political alliance. If they found this place, they would finish the genocide their ancestors started. The internal conflict tore at her. By staying, she brought mortal danger to the only people who had ever shown her the truth. She was a beacon for the wolves. The peace was shattered when a scout returned with dire news. A column of royal dragoons, led by the king's most ruthless inquisitor, had been spotted at the base of the Great Pass. They carried lanterns burning with a strange, alchemical green flame designed to pierce the mountain's natural mists. The elders did not panic. They simply looked to Patricia with silent expectation. The royal mystery had finally caught up to her, and the silence of the peaks was about to be broken by imperial steel. The time for hiding was over. The time for a reckoning had begun. The settlement transformed into a fortress. Men and women who had seemed like simple mountain folk now handled ancient, blackened spears and shields etched with protective runes. Patricia watched as they prepared to defend their hidden home. They offered her a blade, not a ceremonial rapier, but a heavy, functional sword forged from the same obsidian as her necklace. "You are one of us now," the elder said firmly. "A daughter of the peaks does not run. She stands." Patricia gripped the hilt, her royal blood boiling with a new, fierce resolve to protect her true people. As the first of the dragoons' green flares lit up the night sky, Patricia stepped forward to the narrowest point of the pass. She wore the woven robes of the mountain people over her tattered royal silks, a symbolic blending of her past and her present. Below, the rhythmic clatter of armored horses and the clink of steel grew louder. She wasn't just defending a village, she was defending the truth itself. The king's daughter stood ready to face the king's army, the ancient British royal mystery finally coming to a head in a clash of shadow and steel. The lead commander of the dragoons, Sir Alistair, reined in his horse as the flickering torchlight revealed the figure blocking the path. He had expected a band of mountain rebels, not the haunting silhouette of the missing princess. Patricia's eyes, cold and unwavering, met his through the swirling mist of the high pass. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone and old iron. She did not raise a weapon. Her presence alone was a barricade. Behind her, the villagers remained in the shadows, their silence more intimidating than a war cry. The ancient British royal mystery was no longer a secret whispered in palace halls. It was a confrontation in the flesh. Alistair felt the weight of his oath pressing against his chest. He had served the crown for 3 decades, yet the woman before him carried the very blood he was sworn to protect. He raised a gloved hand, signaling his men to halt. The rhythmic clatter of steel died away, replaced by the howling wind through the crags. Patricia spoke, her voice carrying the authority of a queen but the conviction of a commoner. She spoke of the king's madness and the hidden scrolls that detailed a lineage built on deception. The soldiers listened, their faces obscured by iron helms, caught between duty and the undeniable truth of her words. From the folds of her robe, Patricia produced the ancient cylinder containing the great seal of the usurper. It was the physical evidence of the mystery that had haunted the British Isles for generations. She unrolled the parchment, the ink faded but legible in the orange glow of the flares. It was the true record of the royal succession, a document the king had spent years trying to destroy. As she read the names of those cast aside for power, the mountain air seemed to grow colder. The mystery was being dismantled, one name at a time, stripping away the divine right the monarchy claimed to hold over the land. A murmur rippled through the ranks of the dragoons. These men were sons of the soil, bound by loyalty but guided by honor. The sight of their princess, living among the oppressed and carrying the truth of their history, shook the foundation of their resolve. One by one, the tips of their lances began to lower. The heavy iron shields that had formed an impenetrable wall now seemed like burdens. Alistair looked back at his men, then at the girl who had once been a fragile child in the palace gardens. The mystery had transformed her into a symbol of a new era, and the army was beginning to see her light. The peace was shattered by the arrival of the Black Guard, the king's personal executioners. They rode through the ranks of the dragoons with a callous disregard for their brothers in arms. Their leader, a man whose face was a mask of scars and loyalty, drew a heavy broadsword. He cared nothing for the truth or the princess's lineage. He had his orders to end the rebellion and retrieve the scrolls. The atmosphere turned suffocatingly dark as the Black Guard surrounded Patricia. The mountain people stepped forward from the shadows, their simple tools held like holy relics against the steel of the crown, ready to defend their new leader. "You serve a throne of ghosts!" Patricia's voice rang out, echoing against the stone peaks. She didn't flinch as the Black Guard's horses stepped closer. She held the ancient seal high, the symbol of the very power they served, and prepared to cast it into the abyss behind her. The gesture was clear. If they wanted the crown, they would have to find it in the ruins of the past. The mystery would be buried where it could no longer hurt the living. In that moment, she was neither a princess nor a fugitive. She was the architect of a new silence, ending a legacy of blood and lies. Sir Alistair moved his horse between Patricia and the Black Guard. It was an act of treason, but it felt like the first honest thing he had done in years. Following his lead, the dragoons formed a crescent moon around the princess, their lances now pointed at the king's executioners. The standoff held a breathless tension, a stalemate between the old world and the one Patricia was trying to build. The Black Guard hesitated, seeing the sheer numbers of their own brothers turned against them. The royal mystery had finally broken the chains of blind obedience that held the kingdom together, leaving the king's favorites isolated. Realizing the battle was lost before it had even begun, the leader of the Black Guard sheathed his sword. To strike now would be to spark a civil war the king could not win. They turned their horses and retreated into the darkness, their departure marked by the fading rhythm of hooves on stone. A collective breath was released by the villagers and the soldiers alike. The threat was gone, but the world was forever changed. Patricia watched them go, the weight of the crown finally lifting from her shoulders as the first gray light of dawn touched the peaks, signaling the end of her royal imprisonment. Patricia turned to Sir Alistair and handed him the scrolls. They were no longer her burden to carry. She told him to take them back to the people, to let the truth be known so that no other girl would be born into a golden cage of lies. Alistair took the parchment with a reverence he had never shown the king. He offered her a horse and an escort, but she refused. Her journey into the royal life was over. Her life as a guardian of the mountains was just beginning. The ancient mystery was resolved through her sacrifice, leaving the crown to wither in the truth. As the sun rose over the jagged peaks, the army began its long descent back to the lowlands, carrying the truth that would change Britain forever. Patricia stood alone on the ridge, watching the trail until the last of the green flares had faded. She pulled the hood of her mountain robe over her head, her royal silks now just a memory beneath the wool. The princess had escaped, not to another kingdom, but to herself. The mystery of the crown remained a part of history, but Patricia was now a part of the wind and the stone, free at last from the shadow of the throne.